The United Nations chamber was frozen in silence, not a cough, not a shuffle, only the weight of anticipation pressing down on the hall. And then the doors opened. Ibrahim, the young president of Burkina Faso, walked forward without a script, without fear, and without apology. In that instant, everyone knew this was not going to be a routine speech. It was something far greater. What unfolded was not the language of diplomacy, but the voice of a continent demanding justice. For decades, Africa's pain has been explained away, its resources taken, its people forced to live with debts they never created. But here, in the heart of New York, in front of the world's most powerful nations, one man declared that time was over. This was not charity he was asking for. It was not aid. It was the return of what had been stolen. And he spoke with a clarity that shook the very walls of the United Nations. Do you believe this is the moment Africa finally changes its destiny? If you feel the awakening has begun, subscribe now and stay with us until the very end of this story. When President Ibrahim of Burkina Faso finally stood before the assembly, his words were direct, precise, and impossible to ignore. He did not come to flatter the world's powers, nor to deliver empty rhetoric. He came to present a bill and accounting of centuries of exploitation, and he put a number on it. $847 billion. He declared that this was not a request for aid, nor a plea for generosity. It was the sum of wealth systematically extracted from Africa through colonial plunder, resource theft, and the manipulation of global financial systems. He spoke of gold and uranium carried out of African soil, of cotton and cocoa harvested under unfair trade, of oil that fueled foreign economies while African communities remained in poverty. With striking clarity, he insisted, "This is not charity, this is justice." To support his claim, pointed to undeniable statistics. Over $285 billion in gold and uranium taken, year after year. Cotton and cocoa exported at prices set by others, never by Africa. Oil pipelines enriching companies abroad, while children at home lack clean water. Even now, African nations pay more than $50 billion annually in debt repayments, often more than their budgets for health and education combined. But then came the words that turned a bold speech into a global confrontation. Looking across the chamber, warned that if justice was denied, Africa would consider the unthinkable, walking out of the United Nations altogether. The room did not breathe, for in that moment, the threat was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about the possibility of an entire continent refusing to play by rules written elsewhere. Yet this was only the beginning of what would follow. The silence that followed Ibrahim's ultimatum was unlike anything the United Nations chamber had experienced in decades. Diplomats who were accustomed to predictable speeches suddenly found themselves staring at history in motion. Then, something extraordinary happened. From the African bloc, one by one, delegates rose to their feet. Applause broke out, defiant and unrelenting. For 12 full minutes, representatives from 32 African nations clapped, cheered, and even pounded the tables in solidarity. It was not just protocol, it was raw emotion. Some had tears in their eyes. Others raised their national flags in quiet defiance. This was not the decorum of international diplomacy. This was the thunder of a continent declaring that its patience had run out. The reaction stunned the whole. Western diplomats from the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany remained frozen in their seats, caught between disbelief and unease. Cameras caught their shifting eyes, their pursed lips, their clenched fists beneath the desks. For them, this was more than uncomfortable, it was dangerous. If Africa truly moved together, the political and economic order they had built for decades could fracture overnight. Stood silently through the ovation, his hands resting firmly on the podium, his gaze steady. He did not smile. He did not gloat. His stillness carried more power than any gesture. In that moment, he was less a politician and more a prosecutor, delivering an indictment before the jury of nations. The chamber had transformed. What was meant to be a routine session of global leaders now felt like a courtroom, and the defendant was not Burkina Faso. It was the global system itself. Every second of applause was another strike of the gavel, a verdict against centuries of exploitation, and the verdict was clear. Africa was no longer begging for recognition, it was demanding justice, with witnesses and evidence laid bare before the world. But the reverberations of S-words would not end in that room. They would ripple outward, drawing in allies, challengers, and the full weight of global reaction. Outside the chamber, the ripples of S-ultimatums spread swiftly across continents. Within hours, the statement was headline news from Havana to Tehran. From Beijing to leaders of the global south did not hesitate to align themselves with Burkina Faso's bold stand. In Cuba and Venezuela, officials praised for putting into words what they had long believed, that the international order was never neutral, but designed to favor a handful of powerful states. In Iran, the foreign ministry called his demand a reckoning centuries overdue. China and India, though careful in tone, acknowledged that the grievances were real and could no longer be ignored. Brazil went further, suggesting that Latin America and Africa must now walk hand in hand to shape a new economic alliance. But the responses from the West were starkly different. The United States, caught off guard, issued a cautious statement that recognized the importance of Africa's development, but sidestepped any mention of reparations. France and Britain both expressed concern, but could not bring themselves to outright dismiss S figures. Even Germany, often seen as pragmatic, admitted that the historical record was complex, a quiet acknowledgement that silence might be safer than outright denial. Global media split sharply along familiar lines. Western outlets tried to frame the demand as unrealistic or symbolic. Yet in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the coverage was electric. Newspapers printed the number $847 billion in bold type across front pages, reminding readers that this was not aid, but restitution. Talk shows debated the moral and political consequences of walking out of the United Nations. Social media across the global south turned into a symbol, with hashtags declaring, #Africa will not beg, and #Justice, 847. Double quotes for Washington, Paris, and London. The danger was not only the number itself, but the unity it revealed. If Africa truly stood as one, joined by allies in the global south, the old power balance would face its greatest challenge since the Cold War. S-words had left the chamber, and now they were echoing through capitals worldwide. The applause in New York had ended, but the confrontation it sparked was only beginning. The impact of S declaration was immediate across Africa. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, crowds poured into the streets, waving flags and chanting his name. To them, this was more than a political speech, it was vindication. For decades, their hardships had been explained away as mismanagement or underdevelopment. Now, their leader had stood on the world stage and told the truth. Africa's poverty was not natural, but in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa, news stations replayed the 12-minute applause over and over, framing it as the dawn of a new continental consciousness. Commentators spoke openly of a second independence, not from colonial rule in the 20th century, but from financial dependency and political marginalization in the 21st. Ordinary citizens responded with fervor. Farmers in Mali said they finally felt their sweat and soil had been recognized. Students in Kenya debated whether a Pan-African economic union could emerge stronger than the European Union. In markets from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, shopkeepers discussed the figure of $847 billion, as though it were their personal inheritance. Most striking was the response from Africa's younger generation. Online forums, university groups, and street movements began to rally around Traoré as more than just a president. To them, he had become a symbol of uncompromising courage, a leader who spoke without fear to those who had long dictated Africa's fate. His age, barely in his 30s, only amplified the resonance. Here was someone who could be their brother, their son, their peer, standing against empires. But it wasn't just emotional. Political leaders across the continent sensed the shift in mood. Some who had previously tread cautiously around relations with the West began to echo his language. The African Union, often criticized for being slow and divided, found itself under pressure from citizens demanding a unified front. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the halls of Addis Ababa, the message was clear. The era of silence was over. and it was Ibrahim of Burkina Faso who had lit the flame. While Africa celebrated, the speech also unleashed a wave of anxiety in the corridors of global power. For decades, the legitimacy of institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank rested on the assumption that poorer nations would continue to comply with systems they did not design. S. ultimatum challenged that foundation directly. Diplomats in New York whispered about an unthinkable scenario. What if Africa's 54 nations chose to withdraw, not only from the UN but also from Western-led financial institutions? That would mean the loss of a quarter of the UN General Assembly, the collapse of voting patterns carefully managed for years, and a blow to the credibility of the Security Council itself. The very architecture of post-World War II order would be shaken. Meanwhile, talk of a Global South Assembly began to gain momentum, had hinted at a alternative forum where nations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America could meet as equals, free from the vetoes and dominance of the powerful five. What had once been dismissed as fantasy was suddenly plausible. If hosted in Burkina Faso, it would signal a symbolic inversion of power, a small West African nation setting the agenda for the world. In Western capitals, policymakers scrambled. Some feared the loss of access to vital resources: uranium from Niger, oil from Nigeria, cobalt from the Congo, and the agricultural wealth spread across the continent. Others worried about the geopolitical vacuum that rivals like China, Russia, and even India could fill if the West failed to respond. Even among allies of the United States, doubts surfaced. European diplomats privately admitted that the optics of ignoring Africa's demand were disastrous. The longer the West hesitated, the more it appeared complicit in perpetuating injustice. In less than 24 hours, Ibrahim had not only unsettled the world's most powerful nascency, had forced them to imagine a future where Africa was no longer at the margins, but at the center of global decision. In Washington, the immediate response to Traoré's ultimatum was one of controlled alarm. The White House released a carefully worded statement, emphasizing America's commitment to Africa's prosperity, while avoiding any reference to the $847 billion demand. Yet behind closed doors, U.S. officials understood the gravity of the moment. For decades, the United States has balanced two faces in its African policy. Publicly, it spoke of aid, development, and partnership. Privately, it relied on Africa's resources: uranium from Niger for nuclear energy, rare earths from the Congo for tech industries, oil from Nigeria to stabilize markets. Speech threatened to expose this double standard before the entire world. Pentagon analysts were quick to raise alarms about security implications. If Africa withdrew from the United Nations or built a parallel institution, American influence on peacekeeping operations, counterterrorism missions, and regional stability could diminish overnight. The specter of China or Russia filling the vacuum was a nightmare scenario for U.S. strategists, already stretched thin by crises in Eastern Europe and the Pacific. On Capitol Hill, reactions split along partisan lines. Some lawmakers called speech dangerous populism, warning that it could destabilize fragile African economies. Others, particularly within progressive circles, argued that ignoring the reparations debate would only fuel anti-American sentiment and push Africa closer to Beijing and Moscow. American media coverage reflected the unease. Mainstream outlets like CNN and the New York Times framed the demand as symbolic but impractical, while alternative platforms highlighted the moral weight of Africa's case. Commentators pointed out the uncomfortable truth. The U.S. had spent over $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, yet dismissed Africa's claim as too expensive. The contrast was difficult to defend. Meanwhile, Wall Street began recalculating risks. If African nations coordinated around resource nationalism or restricted exports to the West, supply chains for technology, energy, and defense industries could face massive disruptions. Analysts warned that even the threat of unity could drive up commodity prices, hitting American consumers directly. For Washington, ultimatum was more than a diplomatic shock. It was a mirror held up to America's contradictions, a reminder that the world's most powerful nation could no longer assume Africa's silence or compliance. Beyond Washington, the tremors of ultimatum were felt across every major capital. In Paris, the response was particularly tense, as the former colonial power with the most to lose. France rejected the figure of $847 billion outright, calling it unfounded. Yet even French analysts admitted that the number carried symbolic weight and could fuel unrest across Francophone Africa, where resentment over the CFA franc and continued French influence was already deep. In London and Berlin, officials opted for cautious diplomacy, stressing the importance of dialogue while quietly lobbying African leaders to distance themselves from Burkina Faso's stance. Still, European corporations with deep stakes in African mining, agriculture, and infrastructure projects began to worry about contract renegotiations and possible nationalizations. Meanwhile, the global South rallied. From Caracas to Tehran, leaders framed ESCOL as a long-overdue reckoning with colonial history. Moscow quickly seized the moment, offering support for an African-led tribunal and hinting at deeper trade agreements. Beijing, while more restrained, emphasized its readiness to partner with Africa on new models of development, signaling that it could be the primary beneficiary if Africa turned away from the West. Even in regions far from Africa, the resonance was strong. In Latin America, commentators recalled the memory of the Bandung Conference of 1955. Seeing Traoré's ultimatum, the possibility of a Bandung 2.0. In Asia, especially India and Indonesia, the message was seen as part of a broader multipolar awakening, where no single bloc could dictate the future. Global markets responded nervously. Analysts warned that if Africa coordinated around this demand, the shock to commodity flows gold, uranium, cocoa, oil, could rival the disruptions caused by major trade wars. Investors in New York, London, and Frankfurt recalculated risks, while financial centers in Shanghai and Dubai positioned themselves as alternative gateways for African trade. The split was unmistakable. The West saw danger, the South saw justice. For the first time in decades, Africa was not merely reacting to the world order, it was threatening to rewrite it. In the days following S's historic speech, the world's attention turned to Africa. What would happen next? Would the ultimatum prove to be only words, or the start of a continental shift? Within a week, several African governments convened emergency sessions of parliament. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders already aligned with Burkina Faso in the alliance of Sahel states. Sahel states openly endorsed ESCOL, declaring that reparations were not a fantasy, but a legitimate claim. The African Union, under immense public pressure, announced an extraordinary summit to discuss a joint strategy. For the first time in years, headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with the possibility of continental unity. Civil society moved just as fast. Universities across Africa organized debates. Unions called for demonstrations of solidarity, and online campaigns surged under hashtags like #PayAfrica847B and #JusticeNotCharity. What once would have been dismissed as fringe activism now had state-level backing. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso itself began to set the tone for the next phase. Traoré invited economists, historians, and legal scholars to draft a reparations dossier, a detailed accounting of wealth extraction, debt manipulation, and corporate exploitation. By formalizing the claim, he turned symbolism into policy. The dossier was planned to be submitted not only to the United Nations, but also to the International Court of Justice, ensuring that the issue would linger in global institutions long after the headlines faded. On the diplomatic front, non-African nations watched carefully. Some, like Brazil and Mexico, quietly expressed interest in supporting the claim, hinting that Africa's struggle mirrored their own histories of exploitation. Others, particularly in Europe, lobbied intensely behind the scenes to prevent the from endorsing a collective position, but the biggest step was psychological. For decades, African nations had negotiated separately, often played against one another by larger powers. Now, for the first time, the idea of collective bargaining, not as beggars but as creditors, was entering mainstream politics. The speech was not an ending. It was the opening move in a high-stakes game that could redefine Africa's place in the world. The long-term consequences of this ultimatum extended far beyond the walls of the UN chamber. Even if the $847 billion demand was never met in full, the precedent had already been set. Africa was no longer content to play the role of silent participant in a global system built on its exploitation. Over time, three key shifts began to take shape. First was the political realignment's challenge forced African leaders to reconsider alliances. Instead of viewing the West as the inevitable partner, nations increasingly diversified relations, strengthening ties with China, Russia, Turkey, and emerging economies in Asia and Latin America. This multipolar approach diluted Western dominance and gave Africa leverage it had long been denied. Second was the economic awakening. Inspired by Burkina Faso's boldness, more countries revisited contracts with foreign corporations, demanding fairer terms for mining, oil, and agricultural concessions. The African Union began discussions on creating a Pan-African commodities exchange, where prices for gold, cocoa, and other key exports would be set by Africans themselves, not foreign markets. Even the idea of an African monetary fund resurfaced, aiming to break free from the dictates of the IMF and World Bank. Third was the cultural transformation across universities, media, and the arts. Traoré's speech became a symbol of pride, a turning point when Africa stopped asking for recognition and started demanding justice. Young people in particular carried the message forward, framing it not only as a financial issue, but as a struggle for dignity and historical truth. Globally, the impact was equally significant. Institutions like the UN and IMF faced mounting criticism for failing to adapt. Western governments found their influence eroding, while alternative power blocs gained credibility. The threat of Africa walking out lingered as a constant reminder that the continent's unity could no longer be taken for granted. Whether the reparations were ever paid mattered less than the fact that they had been demanded clearly, publicly, and without apology. Ibrahim had shifted the narrative from aid to accountability, from silence to confrontation. In history's long arc, his ultimatum may be remembered not as the moment Africa begged for justice, but as the moment it claimed its seat at the table of power. History often turns not on wars alone, but on words that pierce silence, words that refuse to be forgotten. When Captain Ibrahim stood at the podium of the United Nations and demanded $847 billion in reparations, he was not merely speaking for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for every African nation whose soil had been mined, whose children had been enslaved, whose future had been mortgaged for someone else's profit. That moment was more than a speech. It was a mirror held up to the world, a challenge to the West, a rallying cry to Africa, and a revelation to millions who had never considered the true cost of colonialism. For Burkina Faso, the consequences were immediate. Pride surged. Young people felt the dignity of being heard, and even the poorest farmer in the Sahel could say, "Our leader stood tall." But the message resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. Across Africa news outlets, commentators spoke of a continental awakening. In villages, cities, and diaspora communities, people repeated his words. "We will not ask permission to be free." For the West, the reaction was uneasy. Some dismissed the demand as unrealistic. Others feared it might spark similar claims from Asia or Latin America. Yet behind closed doors, even critics admitted that it shifted the debate. The old narrative that Africa must wait patiently, accept charity, and remain silent was gone. In its place stood a new assertion. Africa is owed, not owned. And for America, the question remains, how should we respond? Do we continue to ignore the calls for justice, hoping they fade? Or do we engage with honesty, recognizing that history's debts cannot be erased by silence? Many older Americans who lived through the civil rights movement may hear echoes of their own struggles in Africa's demand for dignity. Justice delayed, after all, is justice denied. As the dust settles, one truth is clear. Ibrahim has become more than a president. He is now a symbol of defiance, of courage, of Africa's will to stand on equal ground with the world. And so, I leave you with a question. Do you believe that President Ibrahim's bold call is the first step toward Africa's rebirth? Or will history repeat itself, with promises made and promises broken? If his courage stirs something in your heart, then let this not be the end of the conversation. Share this story with those who still believe Africa is voiceless. Comment with your thoughts, because dialogue is the seed of change. And if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, then subscribe, because together we will follow this journey wherever it leads. As himself declared, we do not ask permission to be free. We have risen to claim it. If you believe that Ibrahim is a blessing for Africa, share this story. Subscribe to stand with a continent that will no longer bow. God bless Africa. God bless those who dare to speak truth to power.